Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Special Education Legal Clinic. We will get started in just a minute here. We will give everyone a second to trickle in. But we are talking about applying information from your evaluation team report to the IEP with Danielle Randolph. So we will get started in just a minute here. All right, I like to just wait until 12:01 to make sure everybody's in here. So like I said, everybody who has just come in or who is continuing to come in, welcome to the Ohio Special Education Legal Clinic. My name is Renee Stromsky. I am one of the special education attorneys at Abner Weicker. We have a presentation by Danielle Randolph today, who is one of our special education advocates at Abner Weicker. And as you can see on the screen, it is about applying information from your evaluation report to the IEP. The clinic, as some of you may know, but some who may be new to this clinic, we provide an hour-long workshop on the third Monday of every month. We will be taking a little summer break in the upcoming months, but we still have this month and next month. And those hour-long workshops, which are related to special education, or other disability related areas of concern, are followed by 4 30-minute individual guidance sessions. So if you have any questions or want to just talk to someone, an attorney or an advocate with Disability Rights Ohio, the Ohio Coalition for the Education of Children with Disabilities, or Abner Weicker, then that's a great time to do so. Those are free, as of course this workshop is. This workshop is also being recorded, and it will be posted to our YouTube channel by the end of the week or within the next week or so. And you can find the link to that at our legal clinic website, which I am dropping the link to in the chat to everyone here. And you can go online to lawyersforstudents.com/legal clinic, and you can register for those individual guidance sessions or any of our upcoming workshops. Next month will be presented by Disability Rights Ohio, and it will be on holding schools accountable, myth versus fact. So if you'd like to sign up for our last one of the 25-26 school year, we'd love to have you join us. But for now, I'm excited to turn it over to Danielle and learn more about how we can best apply that information from our ETRs to our IEPs. So thank you, Danielle.
Yeah, thanks so much, Renee, for that intro. So I'm Danielle Randolph. I am one of the advocates with Abner Weicker. I have been here for almost 7 years, so it's been quite a while. Prior to that, I was a school psychologist and I practiced pre-K through 12 for about 10-ish years. So my background really is in evaluations and being able to apply that information to IEPs. As an advocate, I always look through those evaluations and see how we can apply any strengths, weaknesses, and supports to the IEP. So today, it's my hope that I can provide everybody on this call with information when we look at our ETRs and knowing really how to break down the information in those ETRs, because I know just from working with the clients that I've worked with that if you don't understand the tests, the assessments, the way data is reported in these ETRs, it can be difficult to really understand what the information is trying to really provide us. So today, we're going to walk through what you would typically find in an ETR, what we can use from that information to, again, look at strengths and weaknesses, how that can be applied to any goals or services in the IEP. And then at the end, we're going to have some scenarios. And so I want you to try your best to pay attention throughout so you can fully grasp the information that I'm presenting, and certainly pop in if you have any follow-up questions. I let Renee know to let me know what those questions are so I can answer them in real time. So if you have questions, just enter them in the chat. So when we look at cognitive functioning, this is one of the areas that's assessed when we look at specific learning disabilities, we're thinking that ADHD might be impacting a student. Really, any time we have an initial evaluation to determine qualification for special education services, we're going to assess your student or your child's cognitive functioning just to really tap into, again, the strengths and weaknesses, because it's really important that we best align our services and supports with where the child is functioning. Here are 7 areas that are typically assessed. Not every cognitive assessment covers all 7 areas. Some school psychologists will sort of pull from one assessment and another assessment to make sure that these are all covered. But oftentimes you'll see, again, these are the areas that we're looking at. Verbal comprehension is looking at language development. The assessments that are used to look at verbal comprehension test background knowledge, vocabulary, similarities and differences. There's a high correspondence between verbal comprehension and reading and writing. And so if a student is really struggling with verbal comprehension, we oftentimes see that academically they're also struggling in reading and writing. If verbal comprehension is a strength, this often corresponds to, again, being able to comprehend reading material, understanding vocabulary terms, being able to learn new languages, and having proficient writing. We see a lot of students that have strong verbal comprehension, again, really understand language. And so they're able to sit in a classroom and absorb information that they hear. They're able to take in different vocabulary terms that they are hearing throughout the day and being able to apply those when they are reading or writing. Next is fluid reasoning, and this is problem solving. So it's being able to find different ways to solve novel problems. So when you're presented with something new, being able to use inductive and deductive reasoning to figure out what the solution is. It's being able to see different visual icons or information and know how they are alike or different. It's highly correlated with reading comprehension, math, and writing. And honestly, I think fluid reasoning is one of those skills that we use just in our day-to-day life. Being able to solve things that come our way, knowing how to navigate and find different solutions is a really important skill that all kids need to have when they're in school. But again, these are the 3 areas we see oftentimes that are impacted with reading, or I'm sorry, with fluid reasoning. Strengths, if this is a strength of yours or your child, oftentimes really completing those sorts of puzzles. So word puzzles, Sudoku puzzles, crosswords, those things don't seem to be quite as challenging for kids or individuals with high fluid reasoning. Being really great at 20 questions or guess who. So 20 questions is, taking that inductive and deductive reasoning and trying to figure out, who the person, place, or thing is that you're trying to figure out. Algebra is usually a math strength for people who have strong fluid reasoning. Engineers have really good fluid reasoning because, again, we're looking at problem solving. And any sort of STEM subject, which we know is engineering, math, science, technology. So those really do align with strong fluid reasoning skills. Visual spatial abilities, we look at hand-eye coordination. So being able to see something and put it together. So I'm going to, at the bottom, say Legos. Or do I have that in there? Maybe I don't. But solving Lego, using Legos to solve something or build something, that's not a strength of mine. I often tell my kids that visual spatial abilities are not something I'm great at. But my kids have a really strong visual spatial skill, being able to see something and then recreate it with Legos or building blocks. And I don't have that skill, but a lot of my kids that I have personally have that great innate ability. But analyzing and assessing visual information is another great skill that individuals have if they have strong visual spatial abilities. So again, being able to see something visually and then sort of taking it apart and putting it back together. So that mental manipulation. This is highly correlated with math, especially geometry, which again, not so great at because of visual spatial skills were not strong. Understanding directions and reading maps. So knowing where you are sort of in space and where is north, south, east, west, where are we going? Again, not a great strength of mine. But if this is a good strength of yours, then usually understanding architectural design is something that you're good at. Again, engineers have good visual spatial abilities. Being amazing at Tetris and solving the Rubik's Cube, never getting lost. Again, geometry mathematically is a good alignment with visual spatial abilities and completing puzzles. We often see visual spatial abilities and fluid reasoning kind of going together. We consider those nonverbal skills. So verbal comprehension would be a verbal skill, and then visual, spatial, and fluid reasoning are nonverbal abilities. Certainly there are individuals who are strong in all of those, but we do oftentimes see kind of one or the other. So a lot of times people are really either strong with that language component and not so much with the nonverbal components or vice versa. Long-term memory and retrieval. This is being able to remember information and retaining it for the long haul. So being able to learn something, store it away in your brain, and being able to pull it out when you need it. I always sort of give the analogy of our brain being a filing cabinet. So being able to learn something or take something new in and knowing where to file it and then knowing where to find it when you need it. This is a really strong skill needed for kids in school who are taking tests, especially those Ohio State tests that are really testing a lot of information at once. If you have strong long-term memory and retrieval, of course, you're amazing at remembering things. And that is a really great asset for any student. But sometimes it can be difficult to have long-term memory and retrieval if your short-term memory or working memory is weak. So the short-term memory and working memory is really that short period of time that we're going to store that information. So like remembering a phone number, or we always get those codes on our phones. We have to log into something, being able to remember that code and put it in. That's just being able to take something in the short term and then sort of spit it back out. You're not really worried about leaving it in your memory storage for some time in the future. But if you don't store it properly in this part of your brain, then it's really difficult to get it back to the long-term retrieval, which, as I just said, can be difficult if we're trying to then, sort of replicate things down the road. If you have strong short-term memory or working memory skills, you're good at following multi-step directions. You're good with mental math, remembering where you left off in a book, and again, remembering phone numbers or names of people. These skills are really important when you're trying to remember instructions to complete a task. So again, if we think about our kids at school and they're given 2, 3 different things they have to get done, if a student struggles with short-term or working memory, they may get the first thing done and forget the second or third. And that's why visual supports are so important for students that have this weakness. Next is processing speed, which is just honestly how quickly you can perform a task. So the different subtests that are on these cognitive assessments are really looking at how quick you can do something. Sometimes we incorporate hand-eye coordination with some of these tasks, but it's really just this fluency. So like speed reading or being able to do math fact fluency tasks, those are really what you're looking at for processing speed. If this is an area of strength, then students are able to understand classroom directions and finish tasks quickly. Again, that high reading and math fluency, quick decision making, and being able to think on your feet. Processing speed is one of those things that can impact everything else. If your processing speed is slower, then it's going to take you more time to store information into your working memory, which then affects your long-term memory. If your processing speed is slower, you might have a more difficult time doing these visual spatial tasks because your brain is really working at processing that information at a slower rate. Again, being able to understand verbal comprehension things in the classroom. If your processing speed is slower, then you might not really get all that vocabulary and all those different verbal information that's coming at you because your brain is just slower at processing that information. The last and seventh area of cognitive functioning that's assessed in the school setting is auditory processing. This is understanding verbal information. So it's a bit different than verbal comprehension, but they are aligned. Auditory processing, again, is being able for your brain to really figure out what we're hearing, but also breaking that down into those sort of minute little bits and pieces of words. And then our brain takes that information and it decides how do we process and code what we're hearing. This is the number one cognitive process that's linked to dyslexia. And you have to have, so I would say, a specialized test to look at auditory processing because it's not always covered and a lot of the top cognitive assessments. So if you are really worried about your child having dyslexia or having a phonological awareness problem, then you want to make sure you specifically ask for this area to be assessed because again, the school psychologist in your school would probably have to pull out a different assessment to look at this. But it is very closely aligned to reading and spelling and understanding verbal directions. So those again are the 7 areas that are typically looked at when we do a cognitive assessment, when we're looking at specific learning disabilities. All of these things are tied into one another. So again, if we suspect a child has a reading or writing deficit, oftentimes they're also going to be deficient in that verbal comprehension and auditory processing. If they have a math disability or we suspect math is a weakness, then that visual, spatial, or fluid reasoning is going to be the areas we're going to be really concentrating our focus on because, again, there's an alignment there. Processing speed and those memory components impact all subject matters. And so if you have a difficult time remembering things, processing things, like I said, it's going to impact all areas of reading, math, writing, science, social studies, all of the things. They're going to have a hard time just keeping up and keeping pace with all of their same age peers if those areas are deficient. So academic areas that qualify for specially designed instruction. So again, we're thinking through that evaluation team report. And so at this point in time, we went through the cognitive areas that are assessed and we kind of broke those down into how we would then apply them to, we'll just take a specific learning disability, for instance, how we would apply a cognitive weakness to an academic weakness. And so thinking about those, what's the student going to qualify for on the IEP that we are developing with this ETR information? These are the big 6 that we look at. So we have basic reading, reading fluency, reading comprehension, math calculation, math reasoning or math problem solving, and written expression. As you can see here, spelling is not an area that qualifies under a specific learning disability. However, we can tie spelling back to written expression because we know that there is an impact there. Also basic reading. So basic reading is your ability to decode. So being able to read and break those words down. What encoding is kind of the opposite of decoding. So sometimes we're able to sneak spelling into a basic reading goal because really you're kind of working on the same skill. If you're being taught how to break words down to read them, well, the same thing applies if you're trying to break words down to spell them. And then the other 2, again, in Ohio, we have Section 3 of the ETR, which is just for specific learning disabilities. And there are 2 boxes on there that are often overlooked or not checked. And those are listening comprehension and oral expression. Those are technically 2 areas that qualify under the SLD category. So we don't want to forget them. However, they're usually addressed by a speech and language pathologist because they correspond to deficits in receptive or expressive language because they are basically the same thing. Listening comprehension is being able to, again, take different, multi-step directions or take information that we hear and then being able to do something with that. Oral expression is being able to express ourselves orally. So being able to, speak proficiently, being able to take information from our brain and sort of spit it out verbally, that's oral expression. So a lot of times if your child qualifies under either of these 2 areas, they would oftentimes work with an SLP to really address those. Oftentimes, I don't see intervention specialists or special education teachers targeting these areas. So I know when I work with a lot of families, there's questions about qualification. And it is sort of problematic that it is this sort of black and white qualification. It's almost like you have this sort of special education door that needs to be opened, and it opens with particular scores. It is unfortunate because we have a lot of kids that fall in this sort of gray zone or at-risk zone that are maybe on that bubble. Some districts will qualify students who are on that at-risk bubble, but others won't because maybe they have high numbers and they have to be a little more strict on who they qualify. But I do think this is helpful to understand when we're looking at the ETR, when we're looking at those assessment scores, where does the score have to follow or fall, I'm sorry, for that student to qualify for special education supports? And so I just wanted to provide this so everyone can kind of understand where the school psych is coming from, or SLP, or occupational therapist, physical therapist, when we're deciding if a student qualifies or what they qualify for. So on that cognitive and academic assessment, any standard score that's below 85 is going to be considered something that is sort of clinically significant, or something that is really profound when we compare that student's scores to all the other students. When we look at cognitive assessments, we always compare a student against someone else their age. So they're age normed. When we do academic assessments, sometimes school psych will use an age norm, so against other students their age, but sometimes they'll use a grade-based norm. A grade-based norm is helpful if a student if they've been retained, so they're repeating a grade, or even if they've been grade accelerated, or let's say they've missed a lot of school. That grade-based norm can really show where should the student be at this time in this school year compared to other students who are sort of at that same spot. 85 to 115 is our bell curve, and that's what's considered the average range. So anything below 85 would be, again, problematic. It would show that there is something significant. Anything above 115 would be a really great strength and something that, again, they do really well with. When we look at percentiles, any percentile rank below 15%, which I know I hear a lot of parents say, that's so low, and it is, right? We're talking about the bottom 15% of kids, lining all them up. The last 15 of those kids, those are the kids that are going to qualify. And really, special education isn't supposed to be for everyone, right? It is only for those students who have a true disability that's having a significant impact. But that percentile score, I would say, is kind of on the lower end when we think about students and really where they fall. A lot of rating skills use T-scores, or some of the occupational therapy therapists and physical therapist assessments use T-scores. Anything below 30 or above 70, depending on the assessment, those are the scores that are going to really have that, again, black and white cutoff for qualification. If we're looking at a strength and weakness model, which in the state of Ohio, school psychologists can use the strength and weakness model to qualify students for special education services, you have to have very clear strengths and weaknesses. When school psychs input their information into the software to score it, it does spit out sort of a strength and weakness model, which I suppose is helpful. But a lot of times school psychs are really relying on that to show where are they at statistically. So really, when we look at strengths and weaknesses, you have to have an area or more below 85. So it has to be a significant weakness. And then the strength really needs to be in that average range. And usually school psychs will kind of use a 15-point variance. So let's say we have a student that scored 80 in basic reading, but math, they were, at a 95. Right. So that clearly shows a strength versus a weakness. And a lot of school psychs really want to see some pretty big variance to qualify under that model. And again, we want to see an alignment with cognitive strengths and weaknesses and academic strengths and weaknesses. So like I said before, visual, spatial, and math reasoning go together. Auditory processing and basic reading weaknesses go together. So we want to be able to see that relationship. As I said before, memory and processing speed go along with all of these academic skills. And so if we have a below average score in one of those areas, it can impact all academic areas, and you don't have to have necessarily that sort of one-to-one correspondence. Oh, I just said that. What the slide says, I got ahead of myself. It is very common, a very common pattern to see for students with ADHD to have weaknesses in memory and processing speed. I would say a very, very high percentage, probably above 90% of students that I see with ADHD are having weaknesses in the memory and processing speed. It's just that part of the brain that's impacted by ADHD also holds these components to cognitive functioning. So when we look at an ADHD evaluation from the school's standpoint, right, not clinical, but if the school is evaluating for ADHD, meaning they're looking at all of the different areas to see, does the student show characteristics of ADHD? Because if so, they can qualify for special education services. And they're going to be looking to see, are short-term memory and processing speed deficient for the student? Because if so, that does align with that ADHD profile. Now, I know I talked about auditory processing and how that is a very, very important component when we look at dyslexia because that looks at phonological processing. It looks at sort of rapid retrieval, being able to rapidly retrieve information that we learn. It just depends on the assessment we use, but they do use or they do look at those different areas. They also look at, again, decoding real words and nonsense words. So being able to look at a nonsense word and knowing what do these letter sounds make and how can I blend them together to make a word, if you will. That's a really important piece that's looked at for any dyslexia evaluation. We look at segmenting, blending, and rhyming. So when we have students come into kindergarten and they do the kindergarten assessment, or we have these dyslexia screeners that a lot, well, really all districts use now, they're going to look at these components. You know, can that child rhyme? Can they break a word apart? For instance, it could be say the word pick up without up. Maybe not be the best example, but that's being able to segment, so being able to break a word apart, but still know how that word stands on its own. Being able to blend, right? So taking letters or even words and blending them together to make a new word. We look at, again, decoding, we look at spelling, and weaknesses in any of these areas that are listed right here, they would generally correspond with dyslexia. And we would see goals in basic reading and spelling minimally. When we look at the cognitive profile, I would say a typical student with dyslexia, they're going to have average scores in all of the areas of cognitive functioning except for auditory processing. And so not so much anymore, but what I found years ago was a lot of school psychs would just do sort of your basic cognitive assessment that doesn't look at auditory processing. All the scores would come back average. They would do just sort of your basic academic assessment, and most of the scores would come back average. Maybe, your basic reading score might be a little bit lower, but they wouldn't see that as a student who has a disability, let alone dyslexia. So it's really important, again, if you suspect that your child has dyslexia, that you ask for these specific assessments so that you're looking at the phonological processing, you're looking at rapid naming or rapid retrieval. We're taking a look at the rhyming, the blending, the segmenting. All of those are really, really important to not only qualify for special education services, but to write IEP goals that are targeting your child's specific areas of deficits. Because if we don't have these assessments, we don't know what they are. I will say again, since the dyslexia law passed in Ohio a few years ago, I'm not seeing a lack of data or a lack of assessment information as much as I used to, so that's been beneficial. When we look at an evaluation, sometimes we will also assess the child's social emotional functioning or executive functioning. And those assessments are all going to be rating scales. They're going to be rating scales that the parent, the teachers, even the child can fill out. And then, like I said before on that other screen, that T-scores are how these are really broken down. So anything between 40 and 60 is average. Anything less than 40 is going to be significant. Anything more than 60 is going to be significant. But when we look at clinically significant, as you can see in that third bullet, it scores below 29 or above 70. And so a lot of times you'll see that you have these sort of like nice little graphs that school psychs will put into a report. And anything that's up really, really high, sort of in that dark shaded area, or really, really low, those are really what a school psych is going to look at to determine qualification. Again, some school psychs will look at risk scores and still qualify, but others won't. So it's really looking at that statistical information to see how is that child functioning compared to their same age peers. Autism-specific rating scales typically fall under the same category, looking at T-scores, but some use standard scores. Just depends. Adaptive behavior rating scales. So adaptive behavior really looks at a lot of different areas that could impact a student's functioning at school and at home. And so sometimes we've seen overlap between an adaptive behavior rating scale and other assessments. For instance, on an adaptive behavior rating scale, you're going to look at academics and how the student does in school. But a lot of times the questions are going to be more sort of functional in nature, or how that student is able to, I guess, mesh or behave in a classroom setting versus really specific academic information. There's going to be a language component on that adaptive behavior rating scale. motor assessment. So sometimes there is some overlap, but it's really looking at their social skills, leisure. So what do they do in their free time? Any health and safety issues that a parent or a school team might find. Self-care. So can they take care of themselves and do, the hygienic routine that most kids do? Can they microwave food or put together a sandwich? Can they do those self-care things that we would expect a student at that age, whatever age that would be? Are they able to do those things? Community use. And so this was always one. So where I used to work as a school psych, we were a very rural area. And so students were not walking. They were not necessarily even riding bikes to places because it was kind of secluded. And so I would have students all the time, they would do poorly on this community use section of the adaptive behavior rating scale because there just wasn't access. So sometimes we have to keep that in mind when we're looking at the information. Would it be appropriate for that student in question to be able to do these things? Communication assessments, again, usually these are 85, 115 for that average range. But what about students who score well on an assessment but can't apply the skill in practice? So we see a lot of times with pragmatic language specifically. So I can't tell you how many students I have that will be through, going through this ETR process, and we're questioning, whether it's autism or not, but we're questioning pragmatic language abilities. And this SLP will pull that student aside and will give them a standardized assessment. And this student does very, very well. And we have all average or even above average scores. And that SLP might say, well, they don't have a pragmatic language deficit. They're fine. But what if they can't apply the skill? What if they're in the classroom and they can't engage in a back and forth conversation with somebody? What if they can't navigate a social situation where there's some problem solving involved or conflict resolution? What if they can't advocate for themselves and they need to in the classroom? So I have learned over the course of my time as an advocate to really ask for specific assessments looking at communication. So whether or not it was done the first time or we're asking for it to be done the second time, looking at pragmatic language through the lens of a teacher or teaching staff and understanding, can the student apply this in the real life setting? And so a lot of SLPs have different teacher interviews or I don't know, I guess maybe it's a rating scale, and I don't think it is, but they have a different assessment they can use to ask the teachers about the students' abilities in the classroom. And I just think that's really eye-opening for the team to consider. And so if your child went through an assessment, the pragmatic language standardized assessment was all average, and the SLP said, nope, doesn't need anything, I would come back to the team and say, hey, can we look at this again? Because my student's having a hard time with X, Y, and Z when it comes to their performance in the classroom. So I just think sometimes it's important to really look at the disability or look at the weaknesses in a broader lens, because sometimes standardized assessments alone, especially when it's one-on-one and a distraction-free zone, you're not always going to get the same information that the teachers or staff are seeing in the school setting. Motor assessments, so to qualify for OT or PT goals, there really needs to be a developmental or functional need. So a student might need help typing. I said typing shoes. I meant tying shoes, but typing is one thing too. So I must have meshed those two together in my brain. But typing or tying shoes, buttoning, zipping, using playground equipment. So being able to navigate, whether it's an uneven surface in the playground, being able to climb those big, big toys, those big playground equipment. Those are things that a PT is going to look at. Being able to ride a tricycle, being able to walk through the school building, academically being able to copy or cut or write. So those are really going to be the things that these professionals are going to look at to see, okay, so maybe a student tested below average on an assessment, but again, how does that look in the day-to-day? Are they struggling with these things educationally that are going to have a serious impact on their life? Sometimes we have parents that see these issues at home. But if they're not happening in the school setting, a school's not going to qualify them for services. Adaptive physical education, or APE, is sort of a separate offshoot, I feel like, because some teams will have a separate APE evaluation to see if a student qualifies. Others will just qualify them for a goal because they just know the student's really struggling in gym class, and we maybe have some other fine motor or gross motor deficits, and that student needs APE. So that might be a separate assessment you would have to ask for specifically with your team.
Danielle, we have a question, and it actually goes back to
Good. I'll
communication
take a drink.
skills. It actually goes back to the communication skills we were talking about, and how you were saying sometimes maybe a child might score well or present well on the testing, but can't actually utilize the skills in practice. We had a question from Jacqueline. How can communication skills for a child that is capable of communicating or talking or engaging one-on-one, but does not demonstrate those skills in the school setting, how can those communication skills get translated into the IEP?
Mm. I mean, again, we're looking at the school setting and we're looking at impact when the students are at school. So we're not, and I'm saying we, and I use that term, I guess, interchangeably, because sometimes it's we as in parent side, sometimes I still have a school psych brain and think we as in a school team assessment group. But it has to be impacting their education. If things are happening outside of school that are impacting them, honestly, the school team doesn't necessarily care so much about that. And so if the child has the skills, but they can't apply them, then we look at why not? What's the barrier? Is the barrier anxiety? And if it's anxiety, then maybe we need to loop in, a counselor or a therapist or having the intervention specialist work on some coping strategies or role playing activities. An SLP can still be helpful, but sometimes SLPs won't qualify or work with a student. Again, if they're not showing some sort of like strong communication need. But I would again go back to the barriers. Why is the application not happening? What's going through that child's head, or what are they struggling with where they can't. Sometimes we have selective mute kids who outside of school are fine and social, and there really aren't any issues. I have a client right now who's selectively mute, and at school though, or even with friends who they go to school with, they don't talk at all. There's no communication, and that goes back to anxiety. And so that student in particular is working with a school counselor and trying to work through that. They have some outside support as well. But then we have found accommodations to support that student. So he has like a whiteboard and a marker that he can communicate with. He is able to type and sort of write emails to staff if he needs something. So we've been able to find some ways to help that student, but again, it's being able to identify the barrier and then know how to support that student. And it could be through an IEP goal, it could be through accommodations, could be through a 504 plan, but it's really being able to figure out what's happening. So hopefully that answered your question. If you have additional follow-up, feel free to add it into the chat.
Thank
So
you,
some
Danielle.
Yeah. So some additional thoughts on qualification. So again, there needs to be a pattern throughout the assessments and in different settings. So I know I just said that we're really looking at what's happening in school, and that's very true. But sometimes, for instance, if we're looking at autism, we're looking at autism, qualification. Well, a student who's on the autism spectrum is going to be on the autism spectrum regardless of where they're at. And so we really want to see that pattern throughout settings. So are we struggling with these things at home as well as school? And that just helps with qualification purposes. But again, the schools will always prioritize scores on school forms versus home forms because we're looking at that educational impact. There has to be a need in the educational setting to qualify, but that doesn't always mean an academic need. So sometimes we hear parents come to us and they are frustrated because the school team said that their child doesn't have a disability because they have good grades, or the child doesn't have a disability because they did well in the OST, right? It doesn't have to be an academic impact. I mean, IDEA says, developmental, functional, or academic need. And so if the student or child is really struggling with something that's developmental or functional, like social skills, fine motor or gross motor abilities, social emotional weaknesses, including mental health diagnoses, executive function deficits, vision or hearing, right? Those things are going to impact the student functionally in the school setting, even if they aren't academic in nature. You have a lot of kids that can do well academically, but maybe it's taking so much effort to get good grades, right? Maybe it's really taking a toll on their mental health, and they're struggling with anxiety and depression, self-harm because they're just trying to do what they can do to get good grades or to do well in school. Some students with ADHD can get good grades or do well on a test, but man, their executive functioning skills are really problematic. So we just need to keep bringing that up to our school teams when we talk about qualification. It's not all about academics, because when we look at the school setting or educational setting, there's so much that goes on when your child is at school. It's not just housed in this sort of thought process of academics. Okay, so I think I have three, maybe four scenarios that we're gonna work through. And I know this is sort of a different platform. I know you can't just pop in and share, but what I would love to see is some corresponding in the chat. So I'm going to go through the scenario and then we're going to talk about some questions, okay? And so if you can put your answer in the chat and then we can just sort of talk about it and share it. There is no right or wrong answer, so please just feel free to take a risk and throw something in there if you have a thought. Oh, I have it. Is the question before the scenarios? If so, we can get to that.
I was going to say the chat is disabled, but
Oh,
they're not able to use the chat, but they can drop in the Q&A.
oh, Q&A. Thanks, Renee.
Yeah.
Okay. That's helpful. So go into the Q&A then. Okay. So our first scenario is Adam. So Adam is a fifth grade student who was referred for testing due to parental concerns with his work completion in all classes, low grades in math, poor scores in the state assessment in math, and overall lack of interest in school. As you can see, we have Adam's cognitive profile down below. There's a clear pattern of strengths and weaknesses. He has very strong verbal skills, strong processing speed, but those nonverbal skills like the fluid reasoning and visual spatial are not as strong. And then of course, working memory as well is not his strength. Now, when we look at the cognitive profile, I know I told you that a lot of school sites are going to look at that 85 as a cutoff. So when we look at an 89, 88, that isn't necessarily statistically below average when we look at the bell curve. But when we look at Adam, look at his profile, you can see that these areas clearly are deficient. I don't have his full scale IQ on here because honestly, I don't look at the full scale IQ very often because it really is kind of an average of all the different areas. And so I don't put a lot of stock into the full scale IQ score. It's really looking at, again, this pattern of strengths and weaknesses. When he was assessed with the standardized academic assessment, these are the scores that the school site got. So obviously we see the reading corresponding to that strong verbal comprehension. We have lower math scores that are corresponding to those nonverbal weaknesses. Spelling is a strength of written expression, not so much. Listening comprehension and oral expression were assessed. Oral expression was high. Again, we would expect that to be so, but listening comprehension was not. Social emotional rating scales from the teacher, they showed at-risk scores in the areas of hyperactivity, attention problems, study skills, and anxiety. Parent rating scores were clinically significant, so a little bit more significant in the areas of depression, anxiety, conduct problems, and study skills. The school psych also did an executive functioning rating scale, and it showed highly elevated scores in the areas of planning and organization, working memory, and initiation, so being able to initiate a task. Both parents and teachers rated these areas as concerning. Observations show that Adam was passively off task, so that means he was sort of looking off into space or maybe, messing with something, but not being a distraction 35% of the time during a 30-minute observation in math class. So what services do we think that Adam would qualify for? So while we're pondering that question, I will go back just so we can have this information to reflect upon. So if you were the school psych in this scenario, what would you say Adam's educational needs were? What do we think, Renee? Do you have a thought?
I was going to say I was just about to put my video on to come chat with you. Um, we actually do have an anonymous response or an anonymous thought. Specific learning disability with because of the more than 15-point gap.
Mhm.
And someone said, my school would say 504 and accommodations only.
I appreciate that perspective. So SLD, sure, and it would be in math, right? I mean, clearly we see math calculation and math reasoning below average. What do we think about writing? Writing being sort of on that border. Do we think that Adam should qualify for a written expression goal?
And I'm no
Renee,
way.
so you're on here talking to me, so I'm just gonna ask you, what
I
do you
was gonna
think?
say I'm pausing to see if we. Oh, uh, Maureen says accommodations because it's over a score of 85.
Yeah, and so a lot of school teams, you're right, they probably would. They'd write accommodations like access to a Chromebook for typing or graphic organizers, maybe story starter, not story starter, sentence starters. You're right. We absolutely could put accommodations, and for Adam, that might be what he needs. But when we look back at the fluid reasoning, remember I said that does correspond to reading comprehension and writing because if we have to, while let's say we have a prompt that a teacher gives us and we have to write about that prompt. And let's say we have to include a lot of details or, particular characters or settings. That is a lot of problem solving for our brain to do. And then we have to write that all down in a cohesive way that makes sense and checks all the boxes. And so there very well could be a written expression deficit that would warrant a goal. What I would say is looking back at the teacher rating scales, right? The teacher didn't note any learning problems, which is surprising because we had that math deficit. But I would ask the teaching team, what are they seeing in writing with the executive function? We have planning and organization as an area that was elevated, which could correspond to writing, being able to plan and organize our writing. Sometimes we have teams that will write an executive functioning goal and incorporate writing. So it's almost like a way to get around that, I don't know, weird like average range issue. If they say, yeah, the student qualifies for an executive functioning goal because again, we have these areas of concern, we can write an objective that really correlates to written expression. So it's sort of a way to go around that. So I would agree. I would say definitely a math or two math goals. Some districts split up math and one goal for calculation, one goal for problem solving. Some put it together, but I would say math. And I would say probably written expression, but we'd have to ask more questions, wouldn't we? Executive functioning, I would say he likely needs some support there. And then with that sort of hyperactivity, attention problems, looking at those areas of need, typically those would go into accommodations like frequent breaks, prompting and redirection. So there really are a lot of accommodations that can support the student. I know they're only, well, I think it was fifth grader, right? With those study skills for our older students, sometimes I'll add study skills into that section 5 of the IEP when we look at transition, because study skills are important for a student who wants to go to college. So all great thoughts. Thanks, Renee, for your input. I appreciate it. And I think Adam would be great with the goals that we just talked about.
Yes, and I was going to say we just had one more comment.
Sure.
OHI for anxiety and SDI for math.
And so if he doesn't have an ADHD diagnosis, that doesn't mean a school site can't qualify under other health impairment due to characteristics of ADHD. And that's typically how a school site would write that is like, due to, inattentiveness, due to distractibility. So they would list kind of the things that are flagging that would fall under ADHD, but of course the school site can't diagnose. But you're right, anxiety could fall under that as well. I don't recall what his anxiety was. So at risk, they probably wouldn't qualify for anxiety if it was at risk in the school setting. But again, when we look at everything together, we do see some patterns. We do see some things that could be addressed in an IEP. So if we went other health impairment, we could really kind of pull all this into the IEP under that umbrella. Okay, next we have Lisa. So Lisa has always done well in school academically. She's a 10th grader. She's qualified as gifted in the areas of superior cognitive and visual arts. However, last year she started exhibiting some school avoidance that resulted in several meetings between her parents and the school to talk about truancy. Lisa loves art and music, but doesn't want to join those classes because she's insecure about her abilities. She typically wears baggy clothing and doesn't take time to do her hair most days. She seems to have one good friend, but isn't seen by school staff to socialize with other peers. She's very quiet and keeps to herself, but will participate if called on in class. This year, the team suspects Elisa has been self-harming, and she asks to go to the bathroom a lot, which is concerning. She was referred for an evaluation as her teachers and parents are concerned about her mental health. A cognitive assessment was not performed because previously she scored above the 130 cutoff for gifted services, so that wasn't needing to be reassessed. She has scored average or above average in all areas of academic testing, which corresponds to her state testing grades and work samples. So academically, she's doing very well. Her teachers rated her to be within the clinically significant range in the areas of anxiety, depression, atypicality, which is kind of like I don't know, not acting quite as we would expect them to act. Attention problems, social skills, and functional communication. Her mother's scale had average scores except for depression, which fell into the clinically significant range. An autism rating scale was utilized based on the school psychologist's hunch. Surprisingly, Lisa's scores led to an overall total score that fell into the very likely range for autism. Areas of elevation were social communication and self-regulation. So if you were sitting at the table as Lisa's parent, would there be additional assessments that you would ask for if this is what was presented to you? Do we see any holes in this evaluation at all if we're thinking about qualification or thinking about an IEP? So clearly we don't have a communication evaluation, right? So there's no communication evaluation. We have that flag for functional communication on that, probably a BASC, right? Just a sort of overall social emotional rating scale. So that would certainly flag as a concern with communication. On that autism rating scale, we had elevations in social communication. And so certainly if that was presented, then we would say, I think we need to go back to the table and do a communication assessment to look at pragmatic language. Now, I would suspect Elisa would probably score average on that assessment. Again, a 130 or above IQ. She obviously has very strong skills, but the concern would be, again, applying those skills in real time. And so I would ask the teachers to fill out, again, I wish, I'm not an SLP, so I wish I knew what the evaluation was, but I've seen many SLPs do it where it's more, I guess, like a check sheet or a checklist of saying, can the student do these things on, in day-to-day practice? And that's really helpful with pragmatic language. So I would say that's missing.
We've
Um,
got some. So one person from the audience said, wouldn't the cognitive assessment possibly have areas of weakness too? And another participant says a behavioral assessment.
and so so a behavior assessment. If you're looking at, again, this rating scale in the third bullet, that really is an overall rating scale looking at a lot of different areas of social emotional functioning. So when we say a behavior evaluation, usually it would be the same thing. On our, planning sheets in Ohio, I know there's two separate areas, but they're really kind of the same thing, unless we're doing a functional behavior assessment, which would fall under that behavior assessment little tab, if you will. But I don't know if there needs to be additional information from a social emotional lens, but there weren't any observations done, which could have been helpful as well. Looking at, is she passively off task? Again, we have attention problems that flagged, so I think an observation could be helpful. The IQ, so I know I said I don't really look at a full scale IQ, but a full scale IQ of 130 tells me that all of her areas are going to be around 130 or higher. Because if you had a significantly lower score, it would bring down that full scale IQ. And so I would anticipate that all of her scores are probably around that 130 range, and there wouldn't be likely any cognitive deficits.
And then we have one more guess for motor assessments.
Hmm. So, could be, right? I mean, we could have a fine motor need there. It wasn't flagged. I would say kind of thinking through fine motor leads me to thinking about sensory processing because OTs assess for both of those things. And we didn't look at sensory processing. And so a lot of our kiddos we know on the autism spectrum do struggle with sensory processing. So that could be an area where an occupational therapist could come in and really take a look to see if there's a need there. Okay, so we just went through that, and I think I want to say this is the last one, and we're short on time, so we'll see. Okay, so Marshall is a first grader, and he was referred for testing by his mother, who has noticed that he's remained well below average in reading since the beginning of kindergarten. He has been receiving outside tutoring twice a week for 5 months and receives daily small group reading support in school. He is making gains on his progress monitoring data. A dyslexia screener at the beginning of the year determined Marshall was at risk for having dyslexia. It should be noted that mom received a lot of pushback from school staff as they thought it was too early to test because he is in the first grade, and instead wanted to change the intervention strategy and give it some more time. But they did test and they moved forward with that. So this is his cognitive profile. So as you can see, if we didn't do auditory processing, because I had shared that some cognitive assessments don't include that, then all the other areas would be average. When we think, well, he's doing just fine. He's able to process information and whatnot at a decent speed. His memory skills are strong. But as you can see, that auditory processing is well below average. So not only is it a statistical weakness when we look at all of his other areas, but looking again at that 85, 115 average, that 75 is pretty low. And then these are his academic scores. So math is a strength, which corresponds to those nonverbal skills. Written expression and reading, spelling, all those areas are below, and reading comprehension is well below average at a 55. We have to be able to read words, read them fluently to comprehend when we're reading. So for him, he is not able to comprehend. A lot of these tests really don't go quite much lower than 55. I'm not exactly sure what the lowest score is. Maybe it's like 50 or 45. But 55 is pretty much telling me that he maybe was able to answer one question correctly. And that was about it. So clearly we have some reading and writing deficits. There were no concerns noted with social emotional development, no issues with executive functioning, gross motor skills, and social skills were also not a concern. A fine motor assessment was performed because he does write some letters and numbers backward, and he was below average in visual perception. So visual perception is being able to see something, and then of course our eyes take it back to our brain and being able to process it and really tell our brain, what are we looking at? An observation showed that Marshall was on task 95% of the time during reading. So what services do we think that he's going to qualify for? So of course we have, again, the auditory processing corresponding to the reading deficits, right? So we know he's probably going to qualify for reading. I would say word expression as well at a 73. We really don't have any other areas of concern, but again, that fine motor assessment was done, and I guess it wasn't very descriptive here, but really he didn't have any fine motor deficits, so he was able to write just fine as we would expect a first grader to write. But it was really the visual perception that he struggled with, and so a lot of times OTs will qualify a student for occupational therapy to work on visual perception if this is an area that was flagged as concerning. And I threw this in here because, I mean, it's not thrown out there as much as it used to be, but a lot of times people would say, my student has dyslexia because they write backwards or they read backwards. And that's not dyslexia, that's a visual perceptual problem. And so again, it's how our eyes are taking in the information and then being able to sort of process it and then do something with that. Dyslexia is through the auditory and phonological loop of the brain. And so that's a bit different. But we do see a correspondence for kids that have kind of these two different issues that are impacting the same thing, which is reading and spelling. So yeah, I think he would qualify for reading and spelling and writing, and maybe some occupational therapy for visual perception. Anybody else have any thoughts?
Uh, Someone said speech and language or assistive technology slash RIM.
So assistive technology, that might be helpful. That's a good thought. I find a lot of school teams are resistant to an assistive technology assessment because either they don't have somebody on the team who does that type of evaluation, or they just don't know how or what to do. But that could be a good thought because he definitely might need some support with the reading and the writing and that sort of AT umbrella or under the AT umbrella. Communication, I'm not seeing anything on here that would make me think he has a communication delay. I guess we didn't assess listening comprehension or oral expression. So there could be something there, certainly. But listening comprehension usually corresponds, well, not always, but sometimes we see a memory deficit, and I'm not seeing that here. So, but at the end of the day, I think it's always something valid to throw out to the team if there is a suspicion that he's struggling with speech. And maybe it's an articulation error rate problem where we know that does impact his reading and his spelling. So yeah, good thought. Okay, and I think there was only three. So look at me, I'm finishing right on time.
Great job, Danielle.
Thank you. So any ending remarks or lasting questions that you guys want to throw out there before we end our session today?
Anyone want to drop anything in the Q&A in the last couple minutes? Danielle, I just wanted to say thank you again for this. I know for me it was very, very helpful always, just to hear more information about what data we can specifically use from the ETR to really support our asks and advocacy for things in the IEP. Um, Mark
This
said in the
was,
chat that you did excellent. Amy, oh, sorry, Amy, go
oh,
ahead.
that's okay. This was excellent, Danielle. Thank you so much.
Thank
And
you.
will we get access to your PowerPoint?
Yeah, I'm happy to make that accessible. I'm not really sure how it's shared out, but I'm happy to send it over to Mark, and I'm sure
Yes,
Elizabeth
Danielle, I
can
was
figure it out.
gonna
It was
Danielle,
great.
you
Thank
can
you.
share it. I was gonna say, Danielle, you can share it to Mark and or Elizabeth, maybe both, and just say to send it out to everybody, and then everybody who signed up for this presentation will get a copy. And I have not seen anything else in the Q&A. So Danielle, again, thank you so much. Um, like I said, next month is Disability Rights Ohio. I know it's math or not math, geez, myth. It's myths and facts about how we can hold schools accountable when we're not getting what we need by asking for it or advocating for it. So that'll be another really great one to follow up on after learning all of this. And thank you, everyone. I hope you have a great rest of your week. And if we will be seeing you in individual guidance sessions, we will see you soon.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, everyone.